God is still God. God is still good. To God be the glory. How do you say that kind of thing when you pray to God and you get a no? Especially when what you're praying for you know is legitimate. I mean, when you pray for a prayer and all you want is a job, I just want a job. Everybody has a job. I just want a closing so I can stay in this industry. I just want my marriage to work. I just want my child to come home. I just want to be healthy and see my kids grow up. How do you pray that? I mean, so many times when we pray to God, we know for sure that what we're asking for, it's not selfish. It's for the right. It's for the good. It would be for what God would want. How do you endure a no from God when you get it, when you know the prayer request is the right thing? That's what we're going to talk about today. And if this isn't relevant for you today, I hope you'll listen, because this will be relevant for all of us at some point. We're in this series called Waiting Room, and we're getting at the question, what do you do when there's really nothing you can do? What do you do when you're in a set of circumstances and there isn't going to be a solution to your circumstances? This is just the way it is, or this is just the way it's going to be, and it's not going to change. It could be a relationship. You're in a relationship, your marriage. It's not horrible, but it's not the kind of thing anybody would want. But you don't want a divorce. I mean, you don't want to do that to your family. But it's not going to change. It's not going to get better. It could be a health thing, like the video we just watched. It doesn't seem to get better. No matter how much you pray, it doesn't seem to change. What do you do when you're in that situation and there's really nothing much that you can do? Last week we started this series, and today I want to talk to you again about what do you do when you're in that situation and you've prayed and you get this no from God, when what you've hoped from God doesn't appear to be what God's going to do. Today I want to look with you at an account in the Bible from the life of a guy named Paul, and Paul writes this in a letter he writes to a church at Corinth. It's the second or third letter, actually, that he writes to them. Paul writes almost half of the New Testament, and he's writing to them, and he's actually explaining in the part that I'm going to talk to you about, the account that I show you, he's explaining a time in his life when he prayed for something, and he received a no from God. How did he handle that? Now, here's the context of this. Outside of the Holy Spirit, Paul is probably most responsible, any other person, he's the most responsible for Christianity going from just being a small cult of Judaism where everybody in it was Jews to being a worldwide religion. I mean, he had more to do with the spread of that than anybody else. That's just historical fact. And in addition to that, Paul's a person like you in that he became a follower of Jesus after the resurrection. He didn't walk around with Jesus when Jesus was on earth. He wasn't a follower of Jesus. In fact, Paul was a person that he was so devoted to Judaism, he was such a committed Jew, a committed follower of God in that area, that he did everything he could to stomp out Christianity. And Paul has this dramatic conversion. Again, like a lot of you had, you've had this deep personal experience with God, and Paul's probably was more dramatic because, again, Paul's trying to stamp out Christianity, killing every Christian that he can, going from town to town, beating down people's doors, breaking into their house, literally pulling them out and killing them. And as he's going to another city to do that, with orders in his hands that he can do that, God literally knocks him off his horse, blinds him by the light. That's where that song came from. Not really, but he has this dramatic conversion experience. And for a few days, Paul is blind, and God sends a Christian to him, and this Christian knows that this is a guy that's been trying to kill all of us. But he goes in obedience to God, and Paul becomes a follower of Jesus. He's baptized. And at the end of that, God says to Paul, now, Paul, I know you're committed to Judaism. I know you've been a follower of mine there, but I want you to be the person to take Christianity to the rest of the non-Jewish world. That's your mission for the rest of your life. So Paul has this experience with God that's so dramatic. He has faith in God enough that he tried to be zealous for God even before he became a follower of Christ, and he has this impacting mission from God to spread the news about Jesus to all of the rest of the known world. And what we're going to see in this letter is that Paul also has some kind of condition in his life that makes him very difficult for him to do what God has asked him to do. Now, before your mind begins to ask, well, what was the condition he had? Well, the truth is we don't know. We don't know what the condition was that he has, but it was something that was public. Other people could see it. It somewhat was embarrassing to Paul, and there was nothing he could do about it. Paul, in fact, let me just read to you what Paul says about this kind of thing. He says in 2 Corinthians 7, "Therefore, in order to keep me from being conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me." So here's this guy that has this amazing experience with God. He has this deep faith in God. He has this important mission from God. And he himself is able to perform miracles. We read miracles that Paul himself performs. But when it comes to handling this thing in his life that torments him, he can't do anything about it in his own life. Now, theologians and other people that have time to sit around and think about these kinds of things, they have long debated about what was this thorn in the flesh that Paul had. Almost everybody believes that it was something physical, because Paul talks about at one point in this very letter, he says, "I'm not very impressive physically." Some people believe that what it was is that Paul had epilepsy. And so you can imagine the struggle for that. Paul would be up speaking, and then he would have a seizure, and that would be embarrassing to him, and people in those days didn't really know what epilepsy was, and often they thought it was demon possession. So you can imagine if you were teaching about Jesus and you started having a seizure, how difficult that would be. Other people don't think it was epilepsy. They think instead it had something to do with his eyes. There's a passage where Paul talks about his weak eyes, and people think that there was some condition with his eyes where his eyes oozed, which, gross, that Paul has this kind of situation where sometimes his eyes would ooze in some way, and he couldn't do anything about it. So imagine because people one time in this letter say to him, "Paul, hey, you're way more impressive in your letters." It's like they say, "Hey, Paul, we love you, but that eye thing, why don't you just write letters and stay at home? We don't really want to have to look at that thing." But the point I'm making is Paul has this thing. It's public. It's physical. He has a deep faith in God, but he can't get this thing to be done in his life. It just continually torments him. Now, if you read the Bible and you read other histories about the time of Paul, the one thing that you know for sure is that Paul had a deep commitment. He had this deep, incredible faith. I mean, he does a number of healings. In fact, there's one point that people think he stoned him, and they leave him for dead. They think he's dead, but Paul comes back to life. But in this situation, Paul can't do anything about his own situation. So when he's in a situation where there's nothing he can do about it, he does what you would have done, what I would have done. Verse 8. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. Now, the indication is that not just repeatedly, but that Paul, at some points, this thing would just get so over the top of him that he just would plead with God. He would just break down and he'd say, "God, I'm begging you. You know, God, you've got to give me some relief from this. I'm doing everything you asked me to do. You've got to remove this from me. I'm going places. I'm teaching for you. I'm writing letters to people. I'm starting churches. You want me to go and tell people that your son Jesus rose from the dead. How does it look when I talk about a God who can raise a man from the dead, but you can't do anything about this? How does that look?" Now, again, here's why this is so important for me to say to you. This means that Paul has this amazing faith. I mean, he can do tremendous miracles for other people. He will go anywhere that God asks him to do. He will talk to anybody. He will face down anything, but he can't do anything. In spite of his faith, he can't do anything about his own situation. So Paul's in the waiting room. Why are you allowing me to go through this? I do everything you ask me to do. I can heal other people, but I can't do anything about this. You spoke to me, but you won't answer my prayer. So Paul pleads with God. And then he goes on and tells us what he learns, verse 9. "But he," that is God, "said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you.'" Now, grace in this circumstance has to do with power and strength from God granted to us, power and strength that comes to us to do what God is asking us to do. For Paul specifically, is to endure whatever these difficult circumstances is. So Paul's pleading, and he's asking God. And he says, I finally kept asking, and finally I got my answer from God, and the answer was, no. I'm not going to heal you. I'm not going to do what you want me to do. Instead, I'm going to give you the strength you need to endure it. And when that thing is totally in your way, I'm going to give you the grace to do it. Paul, when you go to a city and you're up teaching and that thing hits you and you're embarrassed and people laugh at you, I'm going to give you grace to endure that. Paul, when you get up and you're in the middle and you're helping a church and you're beginning to go and then that thing happens and they're shocked by it, I'm going to give you grace to endure it. When you're teaching in some city and they're already having a hard time that you're talking about a guy who was dead but he comes back to life by the power of God, he's the Son of God, and then that thing happens, Paul, I'm going to give you the grace to endure it. I'm not going to stop it. I'm not going to answer it the way you want. You can ask the rest of your life, and I'm not going to take this way, but I'm going to give you the grace. I'm going to give you the strength. I'm going to give you the endurance to keep on doing life with me in spite of it. Now that's where some of us are right now. Because almost everybody has something that they wish God would change. And we ask Him to change it, and occasionally we even bow up and we get real spiritual and we say, God, I'm doing everything you asked me to do. I'm doing all the religious things. Now are you going to change this thing? Are you paying attention? And for many of us, it looks like God's not going to do what you ask Him to do. So then you're faced with a choice. Do you walk away or do you lean into God? Do you shake your fist at God and say, hey, if that's the way you treat people that put their faith in you, then I am done with you. And if you walk away, which is what some of you have done, and now you're sort of wandering back, it still doesn't change anything. And you walked away from God. Or do you lean into God in the midst of it not changing? Paul decides he's going to lean in. He says, hey, I can't walk away. You know, my faith wasn't based on whether I got all my prayers answered or not. My faith wasn't based on my life being perfect. My faith was based on the fact that Jesus died and was resurrected, proving that He's the Son of God. My faith is built on that. And whether or not this thing ever gets removed from me does not change that fact at all. So I'll keep my faith and I'll just lean hard into God. So God, if you don't ever remove this thing, I'll just lean hard into you and I'll trust that you will be with me and that your grace will empower me through this. And that's where he says in the next part, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. God's saying, I'm not going to fix this and give you what what you want. Instead, I'm going to give you the strength to go through it. In your weakness, I'm going to show off. In your weakness, I'm going to be strong. I'm going to do something in you that's going to be so powerful that because of that thing in you, people are going to look at you and go, how can she have that much faith in God? And God will show up. That I'll be the one that they'll see. That I'm going to put so much strength in you that people will look at you and say, how in the world, in spite of that, can he continue to trust God? And through that, they'll see me. They'll see my power. In your weakness, I'll be shown strong. Paul goes on in the next verse, verse 9. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness. In other words, I've learned that this thing that I wanted so badly to be removed, it's when God makes me strong, so I'll boast about it, so that Christ's power may rest on me. Every day I'll get up and say, God, here's that thing again, and I need you today. God, you have got to show up today, so I'm going to lean into you. I am totally dependent on you. I need your grace to just carry on. Now, I want to talk to you about something, and I think what I'm about to describe is true even if you're not a follower of Christ. I think everybody's had this situation. You know the situation where you dig a hole and then you realize you're about to fall into the hole that you dug. Oh no, I'm pregnant. Oh no, she's pregnant. Oh no, it's the police. Did I put it in the glove compartment? Is it in the trunk? Is it under the seat? Oh no, I forgot to do that project and the boss is coming. Oh no, I left it in my pants pocket and I'm in school and my mom's doing the wash today. I hope she doesn't find it. All of us have had that situation. No matter where you are or what you believe, in that moment, almost everybody I've talked to, you find yourself praying. You pray, whether it's he, she, it, whoever is up there, you're praying, oh God, I know it's my fault, and I know I'm in trouble, but God, if just this one time you could make it all work for me. In that moment, you may not think of it in these terms, but in that moment when you're praying that God will bail you out because you're about to fall in the hole that you know you dug, it's all your fault, and you're saying, God, just get me out this one time. I mean, some of you is right where you are. You're saying to yourself, okay, God, I'm in church. Please, please, God, I'm in church. Let it be okay. But in that moment, when you're praying like you have not prayed, you experience total dependency on God. In that moment, as the policeman's walking up to your car, you're saying, oh God, oh God, oh God, please don't ask him. Please don't let him see it. And he walks up and he says, hey, I stopped you? I stopped you because I noticed that your tail light was out, and this is a warning. I just hope you're having a good day. In that moment, when you are so scared and you are so dependent on God, in that moment, and God comes through for you, let me tell you, in that moment, your life didn't change. You didn't walk away from that and God answered your prayer. You got exactly what you wanted, exactly what you prayed for. You were totally dependent on God, and he totally came through from you. You got off scot-free. Your mom didn't look in your pants pocket. Your boss didn't ask you about the project. You got totally away with it. But when you told that story later, you said, dude, I was sitting there and I was scared to death, and I was hoping, don't look under the seat, don't look under the seat. And he told me I had a tail light out. It was just a warning, and he sent me on the way. You don't even mention that you prayed. You don't even mention that you were totally dependent on God. It didn't change your life at all, even though God gave you exactly what you wanted. See, Paul is saying, God has put me in a place where every day I'm totally dependent on God, and I'm aware of it. Every day I lean into God. Every day I need His strength. Every day I have a situation in my life, not just that I'm dependent like everybody else is dependent on for the air we breathe and all that kind of stuff. Everybody's dependent, but I'm dependent, and I'm aware that I'm dependent. Where every day I'm saying, God, if you don't do this, if you don't give me grace and power and strength, I won't be able to. Which is no wonder why he closes this part of the letter this way. He says, that's why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulty. For when I am weak, then I am strong. When I am weak, I am most dependent on God, and I'm aware that I'm dependent on God. Now, he says, I'll take that over him healing me any day. Now, here's the takeaway from this. Think about this with me for just a minute. Your greatest weakness is God's greatest opportunity to show himself strong in your life. Your greatest weakness, that relational thing in your life that you don't ever know whether it's going to get right, is God's greatest opportunity to see himself strong. Your greatest weakness, that greatest tension in your life, where you're wondering about your kid and you don't know what's going to happen, that's God's greatest opportunity to see himself strong. That your greatest weakness, that thing that you're so afraid about, that health problem that you don't know what's going to do or what's going to happen, is this physical thing in my life. That point of greatest tension in your life is the point at which you are most dependent on God, and it is God's greatest opportunity if you trust him. But if you decide to shake your fist at God and say, look, if that's the way you treat people who put their faith in you, you don't help me in this time of my need, and you walk away from God, you walk away from his grace and strength and power because it's provided to people who lean on him in those moments. See, to get mad at God because he didn't do what you wanted him to do while you were leaning into him and walking, to walk away is to walk away from his empowering grace and his empowering strength that you so desperately need in the midst of something that you can do nothing about. I'm telling you, I think it's the biggest personal benefit I get from being a pastor is that I get to stand by and I have a ringside seat to watch this take place. Over the last 30 years, I've seen two couples that face identical circumstances. One leans hard into God and it doesn't change anything, but they change. And God shows himself strong in their life. Another couple or individual faces the exact same thing and says, God, if that's the way you are, then I'm done. And they walk away, and the problem doesn't change. It doesn't get any better. But their life begins to unravel, and they drug away the pain, or they drink away the pain, or they relationship away the pain, and they marry another person. They go to another person, to another job, to another thing, to another car, to another house, to another thing to deal with the pain. In both instances, the circumstance doesn't change. What brought them to the point of being with God doesn't change. I'm not saying here, lean into God and you'll get his grace and power and everything in your life will be right. In both cases, the circumstance don't change. Either way, they don't change. But one couple walks away from God and their life unravels, and the other leans into God and they find the strength to endure and they see God's strong. One of my favorite all-time quotes is by a Christian writer named Philip Yancey, who says, the only thing worse than being disappointed with God is being disappointed without God. Maybe some of the reason that some of you are back in church, maybe the reason some of you are giving God a chance again in your life is because you've done life without God. And it didn't make your life any better. Your circumstances that you walked away because didn't get better. You didn't take the bull by the horns and make your life perfect. God wouldn't do it, so I'm going to have to do it myself, and you got it all in line. You didn't walk away and find that your life was more. You just found that your life was without God and more complicated and more circumstances in your life that cause more consequences in your life. And now you have more bad memories and more damage and more scars. And you can't blame God for any of that. But the good news is, if you lean into God's grace, his empowerment, it's available to you. His grace is sufficient for you. His empowerment will come to you. This is God's promise. This is God's promise that come to me. Come to me boldly. Complain to me loudly. Come to me. Lean into me. And I will give you strength. In your weakness, I will be strong. I will be shown strong through you in your weakness. It takes a lot more faith to endure a no from God than it does to get a yes from God. It takes a lot more faith to endure having a circumstance where you're in the waiting room and God says no than it does to get a yes from God. Where every day you have to live in total dependence on God your whole life. That's where some of you are hanging on right now, where God says no. No, you're not going to be a reflection of my miracle-working power. You're going to be a reflection of my grace and power and strength in spite of your weakness. And at the end of the day, when you sat with a young couple like I have, when you sat with a young wife whose husband in his 30s died of cancer, and now she's got 2 teenage kids to raise on her home, when you sat with a couple whose teenage daughter isn't coming home that night and she ain't ever coming home, when you sat there, and some of you sat in worse places than I've sat in, when you sat there, you don't want a God who is like me and like you. You don't want a God who thinks like I do. I want a God who is totally other than me, totally different than me, but is powerful and all-knowing and still cares. I want a God who is so different from the world that I live in, who is all-powerful and has chosen to lean so hard in my direction that he gave his only son for me to prove that he loved me. A God who would send his son to be like me so that when I come to God and I say, God, my heart is breaking, Jesus can say, I know what that feels like. When I come to God and say, God, I'm hurting so bad, Jesus says, I know what that feels like. But I also want a God who dips into the circumstances of my life and says, in the midst of your circumstance, in the midst of your pain, in the midst of your weakness, I'm going to give you strength through this. I'm not going to give you a miracle. You are going to be the miracle that I show myself through. Because my grace is sufficient for you. If you spend the rest of your life shaking your fist at God, you'll never experience his grace.
The day that Zach died, there was a huge and sudden storm. The kind that creeps in without warning, comes at you fast, and leaves in an instant. As I was saying goodbye to my love, the clouds came, the earth shook, and the thunder rumbled. 1 year and 8 days after being diagnosed with cancer, Zach stepped into eternity. Ever since I was a little girl, I asked God to bring me the perfect husband. Zach and I met in the fall of 1994, and after 4 years of dating, we got married. We added to the joy in our lives by having our only girl, Lizzie Darling. And then, 19 months later, God blessed us with our first boy, Jake. But our family wasn't complete there. We then had our cherry on top, Luke. We were a perfectly happy family of 5. When Zach died, I was wrecked. In an instant, I had lost my husband, my best friend, and an incredible father. My world had changed forever. My identity in the past 17 years had been so much about who I was with Zach. He was my everything. Even though he dealt with a year-long battle of cancer, it seemed all so sudden. And now the kids and I were left to learn how to grieve. We spent the next few months trying to figure out what this life without Zach was supposed to look like. His absence was overwhelming. I prepared way too much food at dinner, not remembering that he wasn't there to eat it with us. One side of the bed always stayed made. There was no one to sleep in it. His chair sat empty. And I no longer heard the sounds of him and the kids playing while watching TV. We were now a family of 4. Grief is so hard. No one can tell you how you are going to feel or when it will strike. But God is so good and so faithful. He has given hope to our family. Hope for today when we grieve and all of the tomorrows that are yet to come. God has shown hope to my family through circumstances, gifts of goodness, and through the promises in His Word. Zach and the boys were always such huge Broncos fans, and in October we had the opportunity to fly to Denver, Colorado, and get to meet 2 of the Broncos players, Tim Tebow and Britton Colquitt. This was such a dream come true for my boys. And then in November, Family First Organization flew us to Tampa Bay, Florida, to receive the All-Pro Dad Award from Tony Dungy. It was so awesome to see my kids receive a standing ovation in honor of their dad. It was such a blessing to see how Zach's story and suffering blessed others. But even after the incredible experiences God has brought to us and through the love and support that we've received from family and friends, God ultimately shows His goodness to us through the promises in His Word. Jeremiah 29:11 tells us that God has a plan for us, and that plan is to prosper, and it's for hope, and it's for a future. I tell my kids this all the time. God is not a God of chaos. He doesn't just throw stuff to us in our lives and then walk away. He has a plan for us. We might not always understand that plan, but we know that it is good. There are some days that are really hard, And yes, times are tough. But God reminds us of His goodness through the promises in His Word. God shows hope to people in different ways. What's been my experience might not be yours. But I can tell you this: if you desperately seek and run after Him, He will make Himself known to you. As Zach's soul left the earth and went to where it was meant to be, I looked out the window, and as the storm cleared, the sun began to shine through the clouds. It was then I realized that he was healed. He was no longer in pain. At that moment, God gave me hope. God knew that I would be a widow and mother to 3 at the age of 32. Why did He allow this to happen? I don't have all the answers, but I do know that I will praise God, because through cancer and death and grief, God is still God, and God is still good. To God be the glory.
God is still God. God is still good. To God be the glory. And I know some of you aren't there yet, and it's really hard for you to hear. I get that. But if you walk away from God because He says no to what you're asking, your life won't get better. You just create more mess. The great news is at the point of your brokenness, when you walk away from God and you're left with no other choice but to turn and look to God, His grace is sufficient for you then too. God is still God. God is still good. To God be the glory. See, in the end, the question is with or without faith. You can't make your life turn out the way you want it to turn out. The question is, will it cause you to turn your back on God? Or will you lean hard into God and find out that His grace and power and strength is sufficient for you in spite of what's going on in your life? Your greatest weakness is His greatest opportunity to be seen strong in you. Can I talk to you now about next steps? Every week we point you to a card like this. It's on the chair that you're sitting in right now. Maybe you're actually sitting on it. And we ask you to fill out the information on the front, and then on the back we tell you that there are next steps to fill out. If you're with us for the very first time, and all of this stuff about hearing no's from God, it's just a little much for you and you don't want to fill out that card, I get that. I hope that your next step is you'll just sense that God was here and that you'll come back. But we'd love to know that we're here. And we're not asking for anything other than just a way that we can say thank you. We're not going to come by your house and bother you. We have a gift of a book that we think will help you in your spiritual life. No matter where you are right now, you can pick that up on the way out. You don't have to give anything to anybody or say anything. You can just take that book, and we believe it'll help you. We're so thankful you came. We hope this service was a gift to you. But if you're here and you come regularly and you're a follower of Christ or you're trying to figure that out, can I urge you to take a next step? Maybe your next step is you're in a place, you're in the waiting room, and the only next step you can take is just to say, I'm going to come back to the waiting room. You check that box, put it in the offering. We'll pray for you that God will give you the strength, the grace that you'll find to come back. Or maybe you could check the box that says, hey, I'm going to begin to remind myself, God's grace is sufficient for me. I'll memorize that. His grace is sufficient for me. His power is made perfect in my weakness. If you take that card, drop it in the offering. Again, we pray for these cards and those next steps every week, and we'd love to know about yours. Please let us know. Now, as we close, I want us to pray for you today.